Welcome back, my visitors and my patients. I trust you've had a better week. No? Oh, that's just terrible. I'll just have to make sure my disciples are providing a better level of care for you. Maybe we should try some shock treatments this time. Or maybe a lobotomy. I have so many kinds of treatment available for you. Well, look at it. It looks like it's story time again. I am your host, Beyond 5150, and I am sure you are aware, this is my asylum. You may have been brought here against your will, or you may have entered willingly. But now you cannot leave, for I am the master of misery, your sovereign of the spine-tingling, your purveyor of the petrifying. And here I am your god of all things horrifying. You will likely hear things you will wish was never spoken, things you have never heard. Try as you might, you won't find your happy place. Now, it's time to release the terror I have gathered for you tonight. Sit back, relax, and wait for the power of these horrors to twist you into my subservience. Tonight, I'm going to make up for my, failures on Saturday, where I unfortunately had some difficulty with keeping my place. I unfortunately had a headache, which sadly has still remained. I may have to elect for that lobotomy myself. Maybe it'll help with that headache. Oh, well, we'll think about that later. So I do apologize to the author, WeirdBryceGuy. I believe it was the story I was reading when I was having my difficulties was the deconstruction of Jasmine. So I want to start by first apologizing to this author. And I will be rereading this story. That way we don't have these problems this time. Going forward, if I do have difficulty keeping my place, please understand I am having some difficulties with my eyes. I'll be seeing a doctor shortly to have that fixed. Maybe I'll get those new robotic eyes. Might look a little creepy to all my patients. Oh well, who cares? So, we'll get started here. Okay, so the first story is written by WeirdBryceGuy. And, oh, look, I see Mama came by. Good to see you, Mama. Glad that you have stopped by. I appreciate that. Now, as I have said before, and I say every time, anytime I have a author that I read from, I highly recommend you check them out at their web pages. I link them down in the description below. These authors this time only have Reddit pages, so please, if you like the stories, go support them, let them know you enjoyed the stories, and let them know you would like to commit them here at the asylum permanently. Okay, we'll move on. So, again, the story we're going to be reading tonight, starting with tonight, is The Deconstruction of Jasmine. And that is because, unfortunately, I was unable to finish on Saturday, a first for me. This is, again, written by WeirdBryceGuy. His link is in the description below, so you can look up these stories yourself, or let them know how much you enjoyed them. My younger sister died when I was 17. She'd been 14 at the time, and her death had marked a significant change in our family. The change wasn't merely the kind of shift in atmosphere that you'd expect any house to undergo after the death of a child. Sure, there was openly expressed grief, sullen demeanors, and periods of absolute silence, despite the home being occupied by the 3 remaining members. But beneath and beyond these immediate demonstrations of bereavement and depression, there existed a lower, subtly hidden layer of relief. This relief that I perceived in my parents, carefully curtailed when they knew I was within sight, manifested itself in little behaviors and eccentricities that they had otherwise only displayed during moments of open and public happiness before my sister's death. On several occasions, I'd glimpsed my mother stare at some object in the house or some sight through a window, and in this daydreaming absent-mindedness, she'd smile, a momentary lapse in the depression. I at first thought that during these moments she was simply recalling some fond memory of her lost child, brought to the forefront of her thoughts by the object or sight in question. But after it happened a few times, and I took upon myself to direct my gaze toward the thing she'd been focusing on, I became certain there was no correlation between the subjects and my sister. The objects or things seen through the windows or on TV were entirely unrelated to my sister. No parallel or tangential relation could be drawn between the 2 typically desperate subjects. I knew my sister better than anyone, and since we were both homeschooled, there was never a period during which my mother and sister had spent considerable time without me. I had always been aware, totally or partially, of any inside jokes or personal exchanges between them. Some impression that I still can barely define caused me to refrain from questioning my mother about this, decidedly odd behavior. I felt that to challenge my mother's behavior, even slightly, would result in some unforeseen and bizarre punishment or revelation I wasn't yet ready to face. And anyway, my father had also exhibited his own unusual moments of joyful reflection and mirth. When my sister was alive, she and my father would go into the garage, wherein she would watch and sometimes help him in the restoration of one of the old cars or the tuning up of the presently used one. I had no interest in these things and had expressed this to my sister, who then told him. Otherwise, he would have invited me along as well. But my sister loved being a fledgling little auto mechanic and loved spending time with our dad. During these moments of recreation, my dad hadn't considered these practically educational times part of our standard curriculum. My mother and I would lounge around in the great room, and she'd read books from her childhood to me. Well, since my sister's death, my dad has continued working on his cars, making his repairs, restorations, and fine-tunings. But rather than do these things with the grim solemnity befitting a father who had lost a child, he tightens and polishes and oils with a smile when he thinks he's not being watched. The door that leads into the garage from the house is now kept shut, and has always been kept shut originally because while working, he and my sister would tell jokes that they knew my mother wouldn't approve of. But since my sister's death, there wasn't any reason for the door to be shut, but he kept it like that anyway. Luckily, the door can be opened a crack without making much noise, and the sounds of his work are often so loud I'm able to slip it open without him hearing. and through the reflections in polished metal and chrome and glass, I had seen him not just smiling, but grinning, almost madly, as he works on the cars. When I had witnessed these somewhat careless exhibitions of inner glee, enough to be sickened by them, I came to the conclusion that the nature of my sister's death might have been less innocently accidental than presented. Being the sole remaining child, I had no one to immediately confide in, and none of a few acquaintances I had, not a single one close enough for the designation of friend, would have even cared enough to invest in the interests of my dilemma. My sister was virtually unknown to the broader neighborhood, and a few who had sufficiently interacted with her to say that they knew her weren't exactly saddened by her death. My sister, whenever the opportunity arose, and these opportunities were extremely rare, would proclaim her intellectual and even moral superiority over the public school attendees of our neighborhood, often even to their faces whenever we were allowed to hang out with them. I don't exactly know how she developed this perception, because neither myself nor my parents had expressed such a belief to her or about her. Our homeschooling was largely out of ease, since my mother is a retired professor, and certain factors, to be addressed later, had prevented my sister and I from both leaving home for long stretches of time. Luckily, because I'd been around to silence or wrangle her, these boastings of alleged superiority never resulted in hostile confrontations between her and her inferiors. But still, she had embittered them, and I knew I'd received no companionship from them now that she's dead. Not a single person had even expressed their condolences for my loss. Without a confidant, without anyone who might see themselves the odd behavior and vindicate my observations, I decided that my only option of investigative progress from that point was the direct questioning of my parents, separately, about their states of mind in the wake of my sister's passing. Since my father had appeared almost evilly happy in his private moments and had unsettled me quite a bit, I decided to question my mom first. While her far-eyed reveries were considerably inappropriate, in my opinion, there was never a suggestion of malice or familial corruption in them. She daydreamed apathetically, and this made her seem the more approachable of the two. After a day's mathematics lesson, conducted with all the austerity, reverence, and soft-spoken speech of a mother who had lost a child but must continue on with her duties, I asked my mom, while she prepared us some tea, how she'd been feeling since my sister's death. The question hadn't caught her off guard. I'd hoped it might, but hadn't really expected it to, and she responded promptly, softly, that she was working through it and trying to keep her mind on the happier memories. And of course, she returned the question to me, and I responded similarly, although I suspected that only my response had been the genuine one. A hug was then shared, initiated by her, and reciprocated by me with not nearly as much enthusiasm. I then took my tea up to my room to reflect on the disappointingly brief interaction, and plan the subsequent questioning of my father. When he's not working on his cars, my father can more than likely be found in the den, watching the seamlessly endless collection of 80s and 90s action films that he keeps in the drawers and on the shelves of the massive entertainment cabinet. Because of their unflinchingly violent nature, my mother had forbidden my sister from accompanying my father into the den. And despite not being restricted, I never followed him in either. I enjoy action movies, but I knew that this casual ritual was his time to be alone and to allow his mind to sort of dissolve. I have a similar activity, reading. And my mom has her walks. My sister liked to draw, but she hadn't had enough time to develop this hobby into a proper passion before her life was stripped away. After finishing my tea, I went downstairs, crossed through the kitchen, where my mother sat going over my classwork, nodding to herself in satisfaction, and opened the doors to the den. As expected, my father was inside, sitting in his leather lounge chair, feet propped onto the footrest that extended from the base of the chair. A movie was playing on the TV, something I'd seen before, and the speakers blared the shouted dialogue in perfect sonic distribution across the room. I hadn't meant to, but I actually caught him in one of his moments of secret joy. And an almost devilish smile was spread across his face, even though the scene on screen wasn't one that would have elicited such a reaction. The sounds of desperate pleas for help in the face of some ultra-violent threat had covered my footsteps, and I managed to catch several full seconds of observation before he noticed me. He then dropped that almost demonic visage from his face, as if it hadn't been there at all. A smaller, artificially pained smile replaced the broader, devilish one. A smile that said, or tried to say, "Hey, sweetie, what a pleasant surprise. Is everything okay? Missing your sister?" I smiled back, trying to keep my unease from my face and body language. I approached, and he quickly got up from the chair. I froze, thinking that he was about to do something terrible to me, but he simply patted the seat of the chair, enjoining me to sit. He then turned and went to the closet at the other end of the room, brought out a foldable chair, and placed it beside the lounge chair. I must have looked startled, because a brief layer of confusion overrode that quickly assumed mask of feigned gloominess. I willfully dismissed my unease, sat in the chair, and stared ahead. I tried to appear relaxed, immersed in the film, though I couldn't help but feel that the air had been charged with a tension, as if there was a shared notion in the other's dishonest representation of themselves. We watched the rest of the movie. About 30 minutes had remained, and after a short post-viewing discussion about our favorite parts and shared disapproval of the direction of the sequel, I finally asked how he'd been feeling since my sister's death. He gave another pretended smile, as if he'd known that's what I'd come in to discuss. He sighed, leaned back in his chair, ran his hand through his hair, a really theatrical performance, if I'm being honest, and finally said he missed her, and there was not an hour that went by he didn't think of her, and that he tried to let her memory help him keep going and looking forward, rather than hold him back in despair. And as my mother had done, he immediately turned the question on to me, and I responded that I had basically been doing the same. The necessary hug then followed, and I left the den. Later that night, sitting in my room pretending to read, I tried to think of something else I could do, some recourse or unthought of avenue of interrogation to pursue. Both my parents had essentially stonewalled me, and I was certain that my questioning had done nothing but give them cause to guard their secretive moments more closely. Dinner, in an hour before, had been quieter than usual. And as I stirred the vegetables and meat around my plate, I noticed my parents exchanged furtive glances. Glances that bespoke of some mutually kept and evil-natured secret. When it was time for bed, as designated by myself in my tiredness, not a decree of my parents, I turned off the lights and settled myself beneath my covers. The house, being somewhat new for the area, had yet to develop the inevitable sounds of structural strain and overuse, so I had never been able to hear the footsteps of my parents as they crept around the house. Likewise, they've never been able to hear mine nor my sister's when we'd sneak into each other's rooms and play video games beneath the covers, or share answers to homework that we were supposed to have completed before bed. But on that night, after having futilely questioned my parents, I heard a single yet eye-opening noise and practically leapt out of my bed to land silently on my feet. Despite my exhaustion, entirely mental rather than physical, I was suddenly and fully alert and crept with the practiced silence of a stalking panther across my room, out the door, and toward the source of the sound, my parents' bedroom. I knelt in front of the door, barefooted and still-hearted, and listened in. I heard the sleep-dispelling sound again and almost cried out in surprise. Luckily, my left hand had instinctively gone to my mouth, stifling the cry. I calmed myself, steeled my body against what I might see, inhaled and exhaled in total silence, cycling the wariness out with the air. I then gripped the doorknob and pushed open the door. I suppose, before I go on, that I should briefly describe my sister's death. 2 weeks ago, on a perfectly ordinary day, my sister and my father had been in the garage together, working on the cars as usual. I'd been with my mother, who was routinely tending to that issue that prevented my sister and I from attending regular schooling. At one point, after overhearing one of the frequent bursts of laughter that was presumably in response to some unsavory joke, my mother and I heard a sudden, blood-curdling scream. That voice, barely recognized as my sister's, carried the shrill cry through the garage door, up the stairs, and into my room where we had been. My mother and I immediately descended the stairs, crossed the kitchen, and entered the garage, where we found my father clutching my sister. At first, I hadn't seen what was wrong. The car on which they had been working hadn't been upraised, and an irrational fear of my mother's that it would suddenly fall upon my father or sister while they worked beneath. And the tools were scattered in what seemed like an ordinary manner. It wasn't until my father had raised my sister and cradled her in his arms that I saw the source of her agony and his distress. In some freak accident or morbidly momentous turn of fate, a single nail had embedded in my sister's back, precisely at the spot where we are most vulnerable, and of which our mother had taken great care to protect throughout our lives. I knew the spot's fatal importance, even though I hadn't been taught exactly why it was so important compared to all the others, equally vulnerable spots throughout our bodies. My sister rested her head in my father's chest for a while, wide-eyed and agonized. And then her lids fell, and her body went limp. The arms, which had been wrapped around my father's neck, fell to dangle at her side, and all impressions of life and consciousness left her small form. Apparently, In a fit of extreme laughter, during which she had been sitting, my sister had fallen backwards, and in the process her elbow had overturned a box of nails. Among the nails that had spilled out, a single deviant one had incredibly, lethally landed upright, and my sister's back had fallen to greet it, and the mortally sensitive spot was pierced. We held our own funeral, and my sister was buried among the far-spanning backyard of our estate. When I threw open my parents' door, I had thought I was ready for whatever cryptic and possibly any even sinister sight that could lie beyond, but I was utterly shocked, absolutely horrified by what the truth was. My mother sat on their bed, and my father sat across from her in a chair. Beside his feet sat his toolbox, which was open. On the other side stood a lamp with its bulb shining brightly into the scene. A sky blue tarp had been laid beneath everything, including my father's chair, and another had been laid over the bed and its coverings. My mother was seated on top of the tarp. Both of my parents wore gloves, more akin to the surgical variety used by doctors than the common ones my mother's would often use when washing dishes. And laying face down across my mother's lap was a body I immediately recognized. A body I instantly knew to have been the source of that sound which had roused me from sleep and drawn me to that threshold. My sister looked up, and it was my turn to scream. A face, eyeless and cracked, stared back at me, the remnants of dirt. They apparently hadn't finished washing away the stains of her barrier, coated the porcelain-like surfaces of her cheek, and her nose was loose, as if it hadn't been properly refitted. Her lips were normal but faded, and yet not as with the draining of life from them, but the natural fading of color from objects that had never truly been alive, only superficially animate. Her back, bared to the revealing light, was open, and within that gaping crevice, I saw a soul-shaking, existentially terrifying sight. Wires, pistons, nodes, valves, and other objects of electronic and machinery made up her internal organs. There was nothing of the flesh inside her. All was steel and plastic and artificial. Despite her seemingly debilitated state, a smile spread across my sister's face, and those empty sockets where eyes should have been were directed towards me. And she spoke my name with a sickening human glee, a glee befitting a semi-operational automaton. I ran away without uttering an intelligible word to anyone in the room. I heard many sounds behind me as I descended the stairs, and one sound in particular, the unmistakable thud of a body falling onto the carpeted floor, hastened my flight. Escaping into the night, I sprinted down the street, my fright empowering my legs to carry me far beyond the house, farther than I'd ever gone before. Miles flew behind me, and yet I never tired. Despite having never truly tested my physical abilities, I was none of the less appalled by the dark implication. Still, I continued on until terror at the total unfamiliarity of the area, but not exhaustion, caused me to stop. I surveyed my surroundings and realized I had progressed well beyond our neighborhood and had arrived at some sort of industrial park. The steel skeleton of some soon-to-arise building stood stoically to my left, and across the street from this was a factory or warehouse of some kind. Other similar buildings lined the street further down, and a few unoccupied vehicles of varying size and purpose sat within their lots. Despite the cool air, which had rested a frost onto the scant leafage and vegetation of the area, I was not cold, and this lack of susceptibility to the elements only deepened my self-reflective despair. I sat on the curb and peered around me until my eyes rested on that unfinished building, with all its bare railings, girders, and metallic framework. I felt a sudden morbid and an ironic kinship with this lifeless structure. And at that point, I was certain, without question, that I was no different from my sister. That inside my body would be found in artificial, man-made components of machinery, rather than naturally grown human organs. Despite my newfound freedom and this horrific revelation of my true nature, I found myself weirdly longing to return home. A blacker despair fell over my heart and mind as I realized it was probably some built-in feature of my programming should I ever become lost or intentionally stray from home. Seeing no point in fighting the impulse, I got up, dusted myself off, and jogged home as tirelessly as I had escaped it. My parents had been waiting for me. They were sitting on the front porch casually, probably so as to not draw the attention of neighbors. When I had crossed the lawn, the last act of free-thinking rebellion, and approached them, they put their arms around me and led me inside. There was no sign of my sister downstairs, and I assumed that she had been put away for the time being. Before either of my parents spoke, I blurted out the question that had plagued my mind throughout the last few days. Why have you two been so happy recently? Don't try to deny it. I've seen you both smiling, as if your daughter hadn't just recently died. They smiled sadly, and this time I knew the expressions were genuine. My mother spoke first, saying, "Of course, we were saddened by your sister's death. Immensely so, but we were also happy because it gave us a chance to start again, to conceptualize something we hadn't done for so long. There is a joy in creating something, in imagining new possibilities, and how you can improve upon your previous works. I'm sure you can relate to that with your writing. Your father and I weren't happy that your sister had passed away. We were excited about how we could bring her back better than she'd ever been." My father then added, "It consumed our thoughts. She is our daughter after all, and we love her just as much as you do. So, in the times we spent away from you, we pondered the problem, went over ideas we developed separately and together, and visualized her return. I'm sure in our position, you would have been equally ecstatic." I believed them, and hoped it wasn't simply because I was programmed to. But I still had other questions, with the most important, the most life-defining, still unanswered. The why of it all, the reason for having built us and lied to us about the nature of our being. My face must have asked this question for me before my mouth could form the words, because they both drew me into a shared embrace, and my mother whispered softly, It was the only way we could have you. Biological life isn't perfect. It actually rarely is. And in our case, the traditional method of producing offspring wasn't an option for us. So we put our brains together and decided that nature or fate or whatever wouldn't stop us from being parents. It took years of planning and conceptualizing, but we finally produced 2 beautiful children who we love just as much as they had been naturally born. I hadn't fought the embrace, and after those words, I had found myself buried my head into my mother's chest, as I had done as a small child when some unfamiliar noise or a frightful sight had scared me. My father wrapped himself around us, and we stood there, huddled lovingly for who knows how long. Finally, I withdrew from them and asked them a question I had only just then considered. Would it be possible to make me forget all of this, to go back to normal, living with you and her without the knowledge of what we are? I don't want to know anymore. Tears fell from their eyes, and to my surprise, I found my own streaking down my cheek. Although I had cried before, the revelation of my construction had given me the impression that those old tears had somehow been methodically produced rather than naturally induced. My mother wiped her face and leaned forward, kissed my forehead, and said, "Yes, we can do that." That was 2 hours ago. After agreeing to help me forget, they told me to wait in my room while they finished preparing my sister. Since then, I've been writing this story, journal entry, autobiography, whatever you want to call it. I plan to save it to a flash drive, which I'll then hide or arrange it to have it published online somewhere, so that in some distant future of my life or someone else's, a record of the truth will exist for anyone who wishes to read it. Before the night is over, I will have forgotten everything that's happened in the last 2 weeks. My sister's death, my suspicions, the knowledge of what I truly am, all of it. Even though I still have a few lingering questions, such as why their original design of our bodies features such glaring structural fault. And if we have an expiration date, I don't really care to know the answers anymore. I just want things to go back to normal. My family will be whole again. I'll wake up in the morning totally oblivious to the mechanical process of my body, the artificial network of my mind. I'll go to breakfast and sit across from my mother, the retired but acclaimed robotics professor, and my father, the electrician and hobbyist mechanic. And my sister, Jamie, will sit beside me and probably say, "Can I have some of your bacon?" And all will be well. And that was the end of that story. Very well written, I must say. Oh, looks like we have Josie has joined us, and Seraphin, the Midnight Bard. Hope you enjoyed the story. I had to reread it since Saturday I kept losing my place due to a headache. So, we're going to move on to another story. Let's see here. Which one should we read? Oh, I think we'll read this story. This one is by PyroGojira. There is a warning listed here for those who may need it. There is sexual violence listed according to the author, in this story. So if that is a problem for you, please take that time and maybe listen to a different story on my stream. I have multiple streams listed that you can listen to. It's very likely not a significant event in the story, but just in case it is problematic for you, I do not wish that to be triggering for any memories or problems that you may have. So you have been forewarned. The title of this story is I Was Forced to See Through the Eyes of a Murderous Man, written by PyroGojira. My dad had always said me and Mason had a connection. We really did when we were little. Every day was a routine. Eat breakfast, hop on the bus, go to school, probably fail a test, and arrive back at home to do homework. After we finished, the rest of our waking hours was spent playing outside. There was an old tree in our front yard. Its trunk so sturdy it could survive a tornado. Me and Mason had made it our mission to climb to the top of the tree by the time we were out of high school. Once middle school started, something began to happen with me and him. Instead of spending every waking moment together, Mason would go up to his room for hours. I had assumed it was just because of the amount of homework being dumped on us. There was still time for the tree, however. Just after dinner, we had about 2 hours to attempt another climb up it. There were these 2 branches that intersected and allowed us to climb easily about 2 feet above the ground. From there, we would have to maneuver up a few more branches until we hit a spot of thin twigs, just ready to be broken about 8 or 9 feet in the air. That was the spot that stumped us. I remember spending a whole summer trying to figure out how to climb further. As school became a priority, the tree became somewhat of a side project. It was no longer our dream to climb. Mason would much rather spend time in his room. He acted like a nerd at school, so it was obvious he was just reading. He was obsessed with those Darwin Awards books about stupid people doing insanely stupid things. He was somewhat of a mad genius. Meanwhile, I had been spending most of my middle school career doing stupid stuff and interacting with stupid people. I wasn't the best kid. It was obvious by just looking at my room. My room was full of old magazines. My carpet was dirty. I hadn't had a new bed since 5th grade, and my TV sat on the floor next to my fan. I never really bothered to venture into Mason's room, but I remember seeing it a few times. There had been papers all over his desk, books stacked on top of books, and I never once saw his shades drawn back. A hard worker in a hard environment was my dad's famous phrase that he had made up just for my brother. Then it happened. After dinner, on my second day of high school, I went out to climb the tree alone. Mason was apparently busy with something. So, as I climbed up and reached the twig section of the tree, a big gust of wind flew through the air, which just so happened to knock me over and send me plummeting to the ground below. I remember the last sound I heard was the thud of my body hitting the muddy lawn. After that, I fell unconscious, but it didn't feel like I was sleeping. It felt like I knew I was asleep, but I was able to think for myself. There was just darkness. Not one thing was in my line of sight. At first I panicked and thought I had died. After some time I reassured myself that this was just how it felt to fall and hit your head. It must have been about 10 minutes inside my own head until there was a sharp sting in what I felt like was the back of my skull. There was a bright flash, and I was back. I was sitting at a desk in the far side of a room. It took me a minute to realize I wasn't back, but rather seeing something. I realized this was Mason's room. I was seeing what Mason was seeing. My brother got up from his chair and walked towards the door. It felt more than just odd to watch someone move in first person like this. I wasn't in any control. Mason made his way downstairs to the front yard where he saw my body lying on the ground. He naturally called for my dad. I viewed them panic and call 911. That fall left me in a coma. A very, very deep coma. Apparently, I was never coming out of it, the doctors at the hospital had explained to Mason and my dad. Of course, the only reason I knew this was because of my new vision. I saw through Mason, and Mason didn't even know. It was horrible to watch as my entire family mourned me, even though I was right there with them. There was no way to communicate. Over the first days of being alone in Mason's vision, I had tried to watch carefully over him, like a guardian angel, only I couldn't guard anyone. In my thoughts, I began to speculate if this is what the afterlife was. You get to watch the nearest person to you for the rest of eternity. That didn't exactly sound like fun. On the third day of my coma, I saw something I never expected Mason would do. It was early in the morning, sometime around 2 a.m. Mason pulled drawings out of a drawer next to his desk. I assumed they were just normal drawings, nothing to speculate about. But then I saw what they were drawings of. It shook me to my core. I felt as if I saw something not just horrifying, but truly, utterly disgusting. Something no human could, or at least should, have ever imagined. It was an entire detailed sketch of a necrophiliac orgy. Something in my mind told me this wasn't Mason, that this was someone else I had been watching, but the truth was undeniable. This was my brother. This was what he'd truly been working on in his room. It wasn't one sketch either. Multiple detailed drawings of necrophiliac or actions, each and every one distinct from each other. Mason's pleasure was this. This wasn't something I could have comprehended ever. Not in a million years. As weeks turned into months, and months turned into years, I had accepted my fate. The local hospital was where I was going to die, and I was going to die watching my brother commit acts I wished that didn't exist. Over his high school career, I witnessed Mason change his interest from necrophilia to zoophilia, from zoophilia to other unexplainable things. In his junior year of high school, my brother met a girl. It took him a week to learn her name, Lisa, and a month to even speak a word to her. I could see why he would like her. She seemed awfully nice and was definitely a person who could take charge in things. She was the school president, after all. After some amount of time, Mason had acquired the courage to ask Lisa on a date. Miraculously, she had said yes. Even though I knew about the things Mason did and liked, I felt compassionate for him. This This made me extra mad, since only a few weeks before, Mason had gotten his hands on multiple pictures of nude corpses. Of course, he had done his thing with them. Being compassionate for a monster was something I deemed unacceptable. I remember the exact date, November 17th, 1990. They went out to the local movie rental store and naturally rented some cheesy rom-com. After that, they headed back to Mason's house to watch it. I wouldn't bother calling it my house since I had been sleeping in the same hospital room for years. I was forced to sit through an hour and a half of stale film. Only after that was when it started to get eerily frightening. Mason began to speak to Lisa. So, Lisa, do you like to draw? Yeah, sometimes. Usually when I'm not busy with homework. Oh, right. Would you like to see my drawings? They're not that great. When I heard that sentence, I tried screaming, but there was no mouth to scream out of. Mason opened the drawer and pulled out a folder. I knew exactly what was about to happen. I couldn't feel my anxiousness, but I knew it was there. If I had been in my own body, it probably would have been the most stressful I had ever been. Here, these are my sketches of... Mason didn't bother to finish this sentence. He knew what the results would be, just like I did. As we both anticipated a result, Lisa stunned in silence. She stared at the papers. It looked like she had stopped breathing. Do you, like them? The awkward pauses Mason had made only generated more terror. I felt for Lisa. What she must have been looking at. And then she let out a long, high-pitched scream. Mason tried to quell her by covering her mouth. She struggled for her life, but was failing. I could almost feel Mason push on her face and squeeze her neck. For a moment, I felt something. For the first time in years, I felt a feeling of utter terror. I felt cold. I felt weak. And I felt myself lose all hope for my brother. In that same moment, I watched as Lisa's life drained from her eyes, and she passed. I only hoped she wouldn't meet a similar fate to me and would pass on to a better place. I realized that Dad wasn't home. I remembered him telling Mason he was going out to my aunt's house for a game of cards. It was just Mason here. There was a moment of silence. He stared down at Lisa's limp, purplish face. I knew what was coming. I wanted to look away. I wanted to stop it, but I couldn't. No eyelids meant no blinking. Mason almost never blinked. I watched Mason lose both his virginity and his dignity, if he even had any left. I watched as he committed acts that no human in their right mind would do. I watched as I wept. After my brother was fully done, which took about an hour, he carried Lisa's now nude corpse down the stairs to the front yard. In the darkness of the late autumn evening, Mason lifted Lisa into the tree, passing the twigs by just jumping up and reaching the top. I saw there at the top you could see the high school and downtown from there. We had finally reached it. Our mission was complete. The most surprising thing was that Mason had managed to carry a dead body up the entire tree. The horror wasn't done, however. Mason began to skin Lisa with a pocket knife he had been gifted for his 10th birthday. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream. Mason wrapped the now unrecognizable corpse around the branches. He looked down towards the street far below it and took a deep breath. At this point, I had accepted all of it. I figured Mason was about to commit suicide. Figured correctly. And then he jumped. Immediately after he hit the cold pavement, a sudden burst of light awoke me in my bed. I was sat under the fluorescent lights of the hospital. I was wearing a hospital gown that perfectly matched the color of the teal walls. As if time was a perfectionist, and Earth walked into the room only a few seconds later. Her jaw dropped at the sight of me, and she began to call for the doctors. Later that night, me and a more than ecstatic dad came home to the sight of a splattered, suffering necrophiliac blocking our entrance to the driveway. To this day, I don't know what kind of tree it was that was in our front yard. Dude, that was whack. Definitely twisted. Let's move on to another story here. This one is from Vicious Mock. This also has a trigger warning of child abuse. So again, if this is, we'll find a different one for now. We'll come back to this later, just because I'd like to spread these out a little bit more. So give me a second. I know what we'll do. We're going to read from Horror Queen 1212. Now, I did read one section, part one of the story that I'm going to continue here, was I'm a zoologist and I've found something strange. Now, remember, this is the story, in case you have listened to the previous streams, this is the story where the wolves started attacking people randomly for no reason, apparently. So there are three more parts to the story. Excuse me. So we're going to go ahead and read part 2. Again, written by Horror Queen 1212. And this, again, all the authors that I read from listed in the description below. So make sure that you let them know how much you enjoyed their stories and give them some support. Maybe convince them to join the asylum forever. Okay, so I am a zoologist, and I found something strange. Part 2. My name is Dr. Garrett Parker. I am the younger brother of the late Nigel Parker. Growing up, Nigel and I had always had a love for animals. It transcended into our careers. Nigel became a zoologist and I became a veterinarian. I'm currently the head veterinarian at the Los Alamitos Zoo in California. Nigel and I used to always debate about who had the cooler job. He argued that his job was better because he got to travel around the world saving wildlife. I argued I had the better job because I got to work one-on-one with some of the world's most exotic animals and never had to leave the comforts of sunny California. God, I was gonna miss those arguments. Now my brother was gone. He went on an expedition with 2 of his colleagues and never came back. Only Dr. Gemma Stone had survived the expedition, and the story she told would haunt me forever. We had almost fought our way to the car when a particularly large wolf lunged at me, she recalled tearfully. Nigel stabbed the wolf in its side, which saved me, but left him open for another wolf to lunge at him. There was so much blood, and I realized that the wolf had gone for the throat. The look in Nigel's eyes screamed, "Go!" I made it to the car and drove as fast as I could, leaving the wolf's and Nigel's body behind. Log 2. After Nigel's funeral, Jenna contacted me and told me about the oddly aggressive behaviors of the wolves. By her description, I had to agree that something was off. Her hypothesis was that the wolves suffered from some sort of ailment, and it did fit, and I was determined to get to the bottom of this. Gemma had originally contacted me so I could suggest a colleague to start the study on these wolves, but that wasn't going to happen. I was going to be handling this myself. I needed to know why my brother was dead, and at the risk of bragging, I am the one of the best in my field. I set up a task force equipped to handle the situation. Their objective was to bring one of the wolves to me. I wanted a full workup on this animal that could only be done with a 24-hour observation. I prescribed much stronger tranquilizers, and the team was armored and tasked with a variety of weapons. It took a week, but a wolf was captured with minimal injury to the team. The wolf was an adult male with white and gray fur. We named him Vlad after Vlad the Impaler due to his bloodthirsty nature. I was informed that even with the nearly lethal dosage of tranquilizers, he had still remained conscious, though loopy. At first, he was quite aggressive when he arrived at the lab, lunging at the bars of his cage. Whether this is his normal behavior or a reaction to his change of scenery was yet unknown. A noose-like apparatus with a metal rod was used to hold him down as a blood sample was taken. I wanted everything looked at. It would take a couple days before the blood panel came back. It was getting later in the day and time to feed Vlad. The zoo had a specially formalized kibble for wolves in observation. The bull was pushed into his cage. Don't worry about his appetite, as he is unlikely to eat for a while, I told my team. Vlad has never seen kibble and, as such, won't immediately recognize it as food. I finished off slowly. The wolf hadn't so much as sniffed the food before digging in. It was as if he ate kibble every day. Just another oddity to add to Vlad's list. Hopefully the blood test would shine some light on Vlad's behavior. Signing out, Garrett. Log 3. Vlad was nothing like we thought he would be. I had worked with wolves before, and it was apparent that Vlad was much more docile than the average wolf. It contradicted his behavior in the wild. Gemma was in the lab when the blood test came back. The results were shocking. Vlad's hormonal levels were normal. He did not have adrenaline spikes. His white cell count was normal, indicating he wasn't or hadn't been fighting off any form of infection. The disease panel came back clear. This was a perfectly healthy wolf. I was beginning to think that the group had captured the only healthy wolf in the pack when I flipped to the last page in the report. I stared in shock. A drug panel found he tested positive for drypthium, I said in shock. Drypthium? Gemma replied.
She knew what it was. We both did. It was a synthetic tranquilizer or blocker used to wake large animals up after surgeries. Oh. This explains his reaction, or lack thereof, to tranquilizer guns, I said. Nausea was coursing over me as a disturbing truth was making itself known. This wolf was raised by a human, I said. It's the only thing that makes sense. It explains why he's been so docile. It explains his familiarity with kibble, not to mention the drugs. But then why attack humans when in his pack? Wouldn't he be more comfortable with humans? Gemma asked. Not if the person who trained him didn't want him to be. Whoever raised him trained him to hunt humans, I continued. We're looking at a serial killer. Signing off, Garrett. Part 3, Log 4. Behavioral analysts from the FBI had taken over my lab. When I first contacted the FBI, they thought it was all a joke. A serial killer using wolves to kill? They thought I was full of it. Thankfully, I came across Agent Granger. He was a respected, reasonable man who had seen more than anyone should. He kept me on as an expert of wildlife. Agent Granger started the investigation by seeing if there were any non-wolf related deaths that seemed strange in and around the small Alaskan town. A man doesn't just start raising wolves to kill people without using another method first. He needs a payoff, and there are 100 ways he could get it quicker than raising a wolf pup and training it to kill, Granger said. At first glance, they didn't see anything abnormal, until they looked about 15 years in the past. The town had been plagued by a mysterious killer who would stab his victims. He seemed to prefer adult women, but wasn't above killing anyone, really. He had quite the rare pathology, whoever he was. His reign of terror lasted 8 years, only to come to an abrupt stop. It was most likely that he died. A man this sick doesn't just stop if he has any choice. This was the only abnormality in or around that town in over 50 years. Agent Granger was certain the two cases were connected. The main question was, how? Signing out, Garrett. Log 5. Agent Granger found the smoking gun, so to speak. A couple miles away from the town was an old coal mine. Part of the mine had collapsed, killing 3 and seriously injuring 1. The mine was closed down. Why this was important was because this accident happened exactly 15 years ago, right when the killing stopped. It would make sense that one of the deceased men had been the murderer. To try to pinpoint which of the men was the killer, the agent contacted the only surviving victim of the mine collapse. His name was Arthur Brown. He invited us to his home. He lived a couple miles away from the town in a small cabin. Granger and I rode together to the small dwelling. Mr. Brown greeted us kindly. He was paralyzed from the waist down due to the accident. We walked up the ramp to his porch and went into his house. Mr. Brown was in his 70s. He had a warm brown eyes and a kind smile. What little hair he still had was white as the snow that surrounded his house.
Sorry if the place is messy, he said. My wife Loretta kept things clean, but she died about 25 years ago, and I never truly got as good as she was keeping the clutter at bay.
He looked sad.
She was my rock, the absolute best thing in my life. She died of a heart condition when I was still mining at the Williams mine. This was before the collapse.
He rambled on. It was clear he wasn't used to company. He probably wanted to share his entire life with anyone who would listen.
Mr. Brown,
the agent cut in gently.
We're sorry to bother you, but we've been come looking for information about the murders that spanned 23 to 15 years ago. Do you recall the murders? Oh, yes, terrible. It was as if I heard another horror story from one of my mining buddies every week, he stated.
Well, that's just it. Granger spoke gingerly.
We have suspicion that one of your fellow miners was the cause of all that horror.
Mr. Brown looked aghast.
You must be mistaken. We miners might have looked tough back in our prime, but we never hurt a fly. Those were good men, family men.
He defended desperately.
We have no doubt that they were great men.
Granger appeased,
but please, think. 3 men died in that accident. Out of those men, did any of them strike you as odd? No. Oh, well, there was Barry Larson,
Mr. Brown clarified.
He was always quiet, but sometimes he... Sir, I don't want to speak ill of the dead.
Please, Granger said firmly. This is important.
Well, sometimes old Barry would turn right mean. He had a temper problem. He would punch things in anger. His knuckles were often bruised or cut up.
Does Mr. Larson have any living kin?
Why, yes, I think so. He had a brother who also worked in the mines. John was his name. Oh, he and Barry had the same problem with anger. I'd be careful knocking on John's door.
Signing out, Garrett. Log 6. Agent Granger and I were coming to the same conclusion. John was our person of interest. Granger wanted to question him, but felt it wouldn't be safe for me to come along. Mr. Brown offered for me to spend the night. He had a spare bedroom, and quite frankly, it was hard to say no to the sweet old man. I agreed, and he acted as if it was the greatest news he ever heard. Granger went on his way, and Mr. Brown led me to the spare bedroom. It was cozy, with a quilt-covered bed and a bookcase filled with books.
I'll let you get comfortable. How about I put on some tea? Always warms me up,
Mr. Brown offered. Thank you, I obliged, and he wheeled off, leaving me in the room. I went to the bookcase, having a feeling I would be reading that night since I'd noted an absence of the TV. I looked at the books, and my skin went cold. Most of them had a similar title. How to Train Your Dog. Signing out, Garrett. Log 7. I'm alone in a cabin with a deranged serial killer. What do I do? I could make a run for it, but he's got wolves that are trained to hunt down humans. I checked my phone to call Agent Granger. No signal. Gemma had warned me about this.
Tea's ready!
I nearly jumped out of my skin at the sound of Mr. Brown's voice. He was in the doorway with a platter in his lap with 2 cups of tea and some sugar. My mind was racing. He didn't know I knew he was the killer. I needed to act normal. The big question I had was, should I take the tea? Poisoning me would do no good since he was trying to look innocent, so the tea was probably safe. At the same time, This man was deranged. I didn't feel comfortable with the odds of probably. I'm actually not feeling so good. I think I might take a nap, I said.
The tea will help relax you,
he replied. Oh, that's okay, I said. He looked very confused. And that's when I made the dumbest decision of my life. I glanced at the bookshelf. I didn't mean to, but I couldn't undo it. Mr. Brown's face changed to one of grim understanding. He moved his torso forward and away from his wheelchair and reached behind his back before grabbing a shotgun. My blood ran cold.
You're a smart one, you know. Now I have to get rid of you before your ancient friend gets back. I want you to put your hands on your head. We're heading for the mines.
The mines? I questioned.
It's where I keep the wolves,
he said with a smile. My heart jolted. I was going to die, just like Nigel. Panic began to make everything spin. Put the gun down. Had I imagined the voice? It sounded like Agent Granger. I looked up and sure enough, there was Granger with a gun of his own aimed at the back of Mr. Brown's head. The old man's smile faltered as he realized he was caught.
How did you know?
He asked. Trust me, there'll be plenty of time for talking. But first, you're going to put that gun down. Mr. Brown didn't move. You know, Granger said in a steely voice, we're not so different, you and I. We both have killed before, and we're both just fine doing it again. I will say it one more time, and then I shoot. Put the gun down. Mr. Brown hesitated before finally listening. The relief I felt was overwhelming. Granger cuffed Mr. Brown's hands behind his wheelchair. Case solved. Signing out, Garrett. Log 8. Agent Granger had driven halfway to question a new suspect when reality of who was to blame dawned on him. Granger explained to me how he realized that Brown was the culprit. It was two things, actually. The first thing was that none of his windows and doors were boarded like everyone else's. He wasn't afraid of the wolves. Second, the death of Mrs. Brown coincided with the beginning of the killings all those years ago. The interrogation of Arthur Brown helped explain this in further detail.
Loretta was my rock. I've always had the urge to kill, but there was something about her that kept it at bay. I wasn't willing to do anything to screw up what we had. And then she was gone. My everything was gone, and I had no reason to hold back anymore. He continued. I killed so many people. I loved it. It was euphoric. I carried on for 8 years until that fucking mine collapsed and left me in this chair. I couldn't kill anymore. I couldn't wrestle anyone to the ground. I couldn't flee the scene. I thought it was over. Then I saw a wolf one day that had obviously just killed its prey. Blood dripping from its muzzle. It gave me an idea, so I set up traps, got myself a male and a female, waited for them to breed. They had 5 pups, and I have 5 weapons. I kept breeding the wolves all while training them. I killed the original 2, only leaving wolves who knew only me as their alpha.
He was so smug. It was obvious he was impressed with himself.
I trained them to knock down doors. I trained them to kill. Finally, I had a pack of killer wolves 100% devoted to me, and I set them loose. This chair couldn't stop me. Nothing could stop me.
I stopped you, was all that Ancient Granger said before leaving the man alone in the interrogation room. Signing out, Garrett. Log 9. I observed Brown's wolves for quite a long time. Some were more docile ones, like Vlad, were sent to different zoos and sanctuaries. The untrained pups were taught the fundamental ways of survival and released back into the wild. The rest, sadly, were euthanized. Animals, I get. Even the most terrifying beasts have a sanity about them. Humans, I will never understand. They are the true beasts in this world. I went back home and on with my life. I did it, Nigel. I hope you can rest in peace. Signing out, Garrett. That was the end of that series there. Definitely an interesting story. A man breeding wolves to be his weapon. That's pretty nifty. It's a smart idea. Hopefully she doesn't accidentally create a monster, someone else reading that idea. But then again, wolves are naturally aggressive. Even when you try to raise them as a dog, they have that wild streak and they can just snap. So they're never 100% devoted to a person. Okay. Let's see who we got here. Looks like Dustin has arrived. Is that it? Just Dustin, Josie, and Mama, as well as Seraphin. Can't tell who's here, if anyone's still around, but yep. Alright, so we'll move on to the next story. Let's see. Finished that one. Okay. Let's see. Okay. This is another story written by WeirdBryceGuy. It's titled, "There's Something in My Apartment That Cleans My Room When I'm Not There." Oh, you know what? I actually forgot to switch the darn screen. I was still stuck on the starting soon. I apologize. I keep forgetting to do that. All right. Moving on. Again, this is written by WeirdBryceGuy. The first time I came home to find my room cleaned, I thought my roommate had done it. That he had probably made some kind of mess while drunk with friends and had tidied up. Even going beyond the state of cleanliness I typically left it in. Nothing was missing or broken, so I hadn't said anything, considering the matter resolved. When it happened a second time, things were a bit more unusual. Because not only had the room been thoroughly cleaned, it had also been reorganized. My desk, which normally sits before the windowed wall perpendicular to my bed, had been moved to the wall opposite the one against which my bed was placed. Beneath the window was a plant I hadn't ever seen before, soaking up the sunlight that poured into the room. The carpet had been freshly vacuumed, the wastebasket had been emptied, and my bed sheets had even been switched out. I immediately knew this could not have been the work of my roommate. Even if he weren't notoriously lazy in matters of hygiene and organization, still he couldn't have moved that desk on the account of his presently broken arm, a consequence of his drunken adventures. The desk is massive, a gift from my father, who had used it for nearly a decade in his study back home. It has many compartments in which he had stored his writing tools, small books, and other materials pertinent to his work. The key to those locked drawers had been lost when I moved into the apartment, so many of these objects still remain in the desk, inaccessible. With all that added weight, it would have been impossible for my roommate to move it. Unless my roommate had violated the terms of the lease and made a copy of the key to his girlfriend, no one else had access to the apartment. And even if he had, his girlfriend hates me and wouldn't have done something so considerate. Even though logic argued against the possibility, I asked him if he had cleaned my room, or at least if he had known anything about how it had been cleaned. I've caught him in lies before, having become quite adept at catching him in them, as my food often mysteriously disappeared from the fridge. So I knew he was telling the truth when he denied having any knowledge about the incidents. Ironically, he asked me, quite sternly, if I had given anyone an unsanctioned copy of the key. Since things hadn't yet escalated to being frightening, I decided not to do some paranormal activity style setup with cameras and sensors and all that. I also just couldn't reasonably afford such equipment. The idea of some cleanliness and possessed intruders seemed ridiculous and virtually impossible, even though I couldn't think of a more plausible explanation. I figured that whatever the cause, the result was only to my benefit. I did decide to try and do better to keep the room clean so that my unknown benefactor did not have to work so hard to maintain it, assuming, of course, they were planning to continue. Things became truly unsettling the third time it happened. It was about a week after that previous incident. I had gone to bed late, having been busy with some work I had taken home. I still awoke at my usual time, needing to present the very same work to my supervisors first thing in the morning. I hadn't had time to tidy up the night before, nor in the morning. I barely managed to get myself in order before heading out. When I arrived home later that day, the room was clean. Immaculately clean. I'd never been in the military, but I imagine that the level of order, alignment, and neatness present within that room would have made a drill sergeant proud. It would have put the best housekeeping services of the most luxurious hotels to shame. It was model-like. I felt unclean in comparison, unworthy of entrance, standing at the threshold of that pristine space. Something else must have felt similarly, because as I took a tentative step into the room, I was suddenly, violently hurled back into the hallway. As I landed, dust was brushed from a shelf by some invisible force, floating away into nothingness. Apparently, there had been one last task to be performed before I was allowed entry. I quickly scrambled to my feet, more alarmed than physically shaken. I expected, subconsciously hoped, to see my roommate's grinning face peek around the corner, but no face appeared, and regardless, I had a clear view into the room and would have seen even the slightest instance of corporeal movement. There was nothing visible that could have propelled me backwards. I hadn't tripped or stumbled, hadn't the momentum of any sort of faltering to have occurred. Patently afraid, I betrayed my logical mind and calmed out into the room. The stuttered, hello? Seemed to echo through the great space, as if the walls had receded to a greater dimensions on some other plane, leaving only after images of their original placements. When no one answered, I decided to again try entering the room. I remembered then that my roommate wasn't even home, that I was alone with the apparently immaterial presence. I didn't want to leave the room in case the seemingly malevolent entity decided to wreak havoc elsewhere. It wasn't courage that led me to step inside and close the door, but neither was it stupidity. I just wanted, if possible, to ensure that it did not get out. The furniture hadn't been moved again, but certain of my posters and personal items had been removed. Pretty much anything that had shown or presented or represented what you might call distasteful or controversial image was absent or tucked behind more appropriate items. Posters showcasing death metal members or their album covers, video game figurines of monstrous creatures, books whose spines detailed titles pertaining to the horrific, macabre, and occult, all removed or hidden. Who or whatever had cleaned the room had taken special care to eradicate or obfuscate anything that might have made a nun or an old lady scowl. The air, in which I had somewhat anticipated to be heavy with some spectral residue, was surprisingly light and breathable, as if the atmosphere itself had been sanitized. It was paradoxically both calming and terrifying, physically refreshing, but psychologically unsettling. The force, or entity, had already shown itself to be capable of physical violence, and while it hadn't acted again, the possibility that I was powerless to defend myself did not, by even the slightest measure, assuage my fright. I was knocked out of my terror-induced contemplations by the collision of a small object against my forehead. It hadn't hurt much, so I wasn't immediately sent cowering into a corner. I looked and found the item and picked it up. It was a key, a very old one, with an inscription on its face that had faded to illegibility long ago. The only thing in the room to which it might have belonged was my father's old desk. Cautiously, feeling the gaze of some unseen observer upon me, I walked to the desk and inserted the key into the topmost drawer. As I suspected, it was a perfect fit. There were old pens and large books with time-yellowed pages within the drawer. Unlocking several more drawers, I found items of similar use and antiquity. I left these where I found them, not wanting to get a single speck of dust anywhere on the freshly polished surface of the desk. All that remained to be unlocked was the right side's lowest drawer, the largest of them all. I unlocked and opened the compartment and found something wholly unlike the other items inside. It was a vase, darkly colored, as if sculpted in obsidian, but made of porcelain. It was capped by a small knob, also porcelain, with remnants of some sort of wax sealant ringed at intervals around its rim. There were no markings or embellishments that could have been seen on the body of the vessel, but the structure and craftsmanship nevertheless suggested it was of high value, financially or culturally. I placed it on the desk, handling it with a delicate care that I hadn't consciously thought to employ. It had what can best be described as a funeral air, and I guessed at its contents, feeling them gently toss about within the vase. In that moment, I had forgotten, or perhaps was made to forget, that the shocking supernatural happenings of only a few moments before. A morbid curiosity had taken hold in my mind, and urged by a powerful, though unknown impetus, I picked away the sealant and removed the cap. As if it had been pressed against the cap, something within surged upwards, propelling me back. The source of the eruption was invisible, but the pressure was undeniably tangible. I was knocked to the floor by a force even greater than the one that had pushed me into the hall. I feebly climbed onto my bed, and the wind knocked out of me. The vase, despite the sudden eruption, hadn't moved from its place on the desk. Whatever had poured forth from within had done so without even making the thing wobble. I sat there, both amazed and horrified, as the imperceptible force then became partially visible, a wavering, translucent form in the shape of a person. Though it stood over me, it was apparently rather short, and I knew if I stood, I would at least be a foot taller. But I was totally subdued by fear, and it might have well been some phantom of some titan standing over me. Finally, dear Lord, now you listen here. I didn't spend the better part of my youth teaching my son how to take care of himself, only for him to squander that knowledge and allow his own son to live like this. I know you're an adult and can do what you want, but that doesn't mean you should live in squalor. Your father managed to learn, eventually. I expect you to as well. I never want to see this room in the state it was ever again. Do you understand me? I nodded, utterly perplexed by the specter's heated lecture, unsure of how else to respond. Good. I don't want to see any more of that filth around here. How do you expect to have a nice young woman over with all those satanic images and horrible little plastic men around? I won't have my grandson become some young punk. Now give Grandma a kiss. And then the familiarity of that voice hit me. Even with the slightly ghostly intonation, the voice was plainly that of my grandmother's, and her unique outline was vaguely apparent in the apparition as well. Still, fear hadn't yet left me, because my grandmother was dead. And up until that point, I hadn't believed in life after death at all. But it was undeniable. My grandmother, or some spiritual manifestation of her, had just chastised me on my sloppiness. Well, I perceived that the image had drawn closer, and remembered she had demanded a kiss. I fought through the terror that stiffened my body, and leaned forward with lips pursed. A moment later, something smooth yet cold, like a cheek that had been without warmth of life for quite some time, touched my lips. I withdrew a moment later, the action completed, and stared fearfully at the ghostly figure, who seemed satisfied. That's a nice boy. Now, if it wouldn't inconvenience you, do you mind driving Grammy to your father's house? It's obvious that in his incorrigible forgetfulness, he failed to perform the one thing I asked him to do once I'm at my end. I told him to scatter my ashes throughout my garden, where I've buried so many of my furry little children over the years. and where I've planted so many beautiful things. Take me to him so I can remind him of the promise he made to his frail and dying mother all those weeks ago." There was an almost imperceptible snicker that followed the latter part of her speech. I obviously had so many questions regarding the afterlife and her obviously stubborn spiritual persistence, but she dismissed them all and demanded that I take her to my dad without delay. Unable to argue, I picked up the vase and she returned therein just as violently as she had left it. And just as I had driven her to the pharmacy or the grocery store during her life, I drove her vase-bound spirit to my dad's house. Along the way, she criticized my driving, saying I drove like a rock star tour bus driver. We arrived, and she quieted up as I strode across the front lawn. I knocked, and my dad answered a few moments later. I immediately put the vase into his arms and said I'd found it in the desk. His surprise at my sudden visit quickly turned to shock at seeing the vase. And then that gave way to deep remorse upon remembering what he had vowed to do. I patted him on the shoulder and quickly turned away, almost jogging to my car. I took one last glance before pulling out of the driveway, smiling to myself as my father tentatively removed the cap from the vase. And that is the end of that story. Honestly, that was a great story. Excellent. Loved it. Good one. Oh, looks like Alex has arrived. Welcome, Alex. Welcome to the asylum. Anyway, so we're going to move on to another story here. What do we got? Okay, we have one written by Blue Wake. I don't believe I read this one Saturday. However, it is possible. So if I did, I do apologize for rereading it. But considering I had difficulties towards the end of the stream on Saturday, I figured it'd be a good idea to at least read this. Okay, so this one is, again, written by Blue Wake. Details of to get a hold of him through Reddit is listed in the description below. It's a submission link. There you can look at all the stories that he has available. The title of this story is I'm a PhD student researching urban legends. My visit to Devil's Tower haunts me. I'm a doctoral student at a major university in New England. To keep the experiences I'll soon disclose separate from my public academic persona, I won't say exactly where. I study cultural anthropology, which is the study of ideas, beliefs, traditions, and practices which shape human societies. The specific focus of my research is contemporary folklore, commonly known as urban legends. When I was a kid, I was fascinated with the stories that my schoolmates relayed in whispers on the playground or at sleepovers, flashlights held low to illuminate their faces. These stories captivated me with their appeals to the supernatural, horror, and mystery, promising knowledge of forbidden secrets lurking under society's facade. Unlike some classical folktales, which are obvious fiction, urban legends are presented as truth. If you've heard an urban legend, you know the deal. This story really happened to so-and-so's friend, his cousin's girlfriend. That beguiling promise of truth that if I look closely enough, I'd find some in these tall tales weren't all so tall after all. Maybe why I took an academic interest in urban legends. And if they are only stories, why is it that it entrenches them in our collective consciousness, kept alive from one generation to the next by word of mouth alone? That's the question I seek to answer in my upcoming dissertation. My research process consists both of review of academic literature and actual fieldwork. In the field, I conduct archival research, personal interviews, and surveys of locations relevant to various urban legends. This research often explains the phenomena associated with certain stories. Take, for instance, gravity hills. Many American towns contain roads where local legend says that if you put your car in neutral, the spirits of children killed in hit-and-run accidents will push your car uphill to prevent you from suffering a similar fate. However, research of public records usually proves there were no children fatally struck by automobiles in those locations. Review of scientific literature explains these as optical illusions, where an obscured horizon makes a downhill slope look like an uphill slope. Location surveys also come in handy. One example is my survey of New Jersey's Heartbeat Road. Folks in the town of Montville say that way back in the day, an axe-wielding maniac attacked a teenage couple in a wooded road and killed the girl. For years afterward, teenagers would park on the road and listen quietly for the sound of the girl's ghostly heartbeat. Inspecting the site myself, I found a defunct water pump house off the road. Back when the pump house was in operation, it would have emitted a noise that sounded a lot like a loud heartbeat. Simple explanation. But some urban legends defy explanations. In rare instances, investigation only strengthens their claims. That brings me to one of the most terrifying experiences I have ever had in the field. My visit to Devil's Tower. I'd been on an extended research trip, visiting sites connected to several legends, including Heartbeat Road. After wrapping up in Montville, I began my drive back north to New England. A few stops planned along the way. The next was to Devil's Tower, less than an hour northeast. Now, Devil's Tower is an old stone structure that looms over Rio Vista, an extravagantly wealthy neighborhood in Alpine, New Jersey. Before Rio Vista was a residential neighborhood, it was part of an estate constructed by sugar baron Manuel Redonia. The Redonia estate was sprawling, over 200 acres, and beautiful, nestled on the cliffs overlooking the Hudson River. According to local legend, Redonia built the tower in the early 20th century to give his wife, Harriet, a view of New York City's vast skyline. But the towering skyscrapers of Manhattan weren't the only things she could see. One night, Harriet was looking out from the tower when she noticed her husband with another woman. Filled with despair, Harriet leapt to her death from the tower. Sometime later, rumors of supernatural occurrences surrounding this tower began. Despite the eventual dissolution of the Redonia estate and later development of Rio Vista, the stories persist to this day. The most significant rumor concerns what happens when you drive in circles around Devil's Tower, which serves as a roundabout at the end of a long road. There are several versions of the story, but most agree that if you drive around Devil's Tower 3 times at night, Harriet Redonya's ghost will appear and cause your car to crash. Opinions are split on whether one must drive forwards or backwards to properly complete the ritual. Many legends I research involve small rituals like this one. Performing the rituals provides valuable insight, but my supervising professor doesn't always condone it. Sometimes they require trespassing or other not so legal activity. They also aren't always safe. Putting your car in neutral on a busy road to see if it rolls uphill isn't the smartest idea. I almost always perform the rituals anyway. The night I traveled... Excuse me, I think I'm seeing an issue with the stream, it looks like. Okay, so that was weird. I saw that the stream was buffering for some reason, but I don't see any issues, so I guess it must have been a YouTube issue. Okay, back to the story then. As I turned onto Rio Vista's long entry road, I was awestruck. Opulent chateau-style homes lined the road, set back behind massive lawns and thickets of manicured pine trees. The homes were protected by the type of walls you'd expect to find securing a medieval fortress. But these magnificent homes are sideshows to the true spectacle, the imposing Gothic tower at the end of the road. I drove closer, marveling at its grandeur. Made of large gray stones, it must have been 100 feet tall. I parked at the edge of the roundabout and stepped out to take a closer look. A series of glassless windows stretched up the tower, culminating in a row of 3 near the top. Long ago, they'd been filled with real stained glass. Now there was only an empty frame exposing the tower's dark interior, where legend said Harriet Redonja would still be seen. At the tower's base was a giant archway through which I could see the other side of the roundabout. The archway was gated, a sign warning against vandalism hanging from its iron bars. I'd read that the tower had been sealed off long ago to discourage mischievous teenagers, and there were no longer access to its peak. If I saw something up there, it wouldn't be a living human being. I chose to circle the tower backwards, first on a hunch that it was the real version of the ritual. And driving forwards was too simple. For a supposed supernatural ritual to survive as an urban legend for decades, it has to be a hassle. If it's too easy, everyone will do it, and the legend will lose its mystique and be forgotten. I was starting the car back up when I noticed another vehicle in my rear view. It had turned off a side street that snaked off the long road leading to the tower. The car was a few hundred feet behind me, advancing slowly. Expecting it to turn onto one of the driveways leading along the road before it ever got close to me, I didn't hesitate. I pulled into the center of the roundabout, aligned with the archway at the base of the tower. I planned to use the archway as a marker. After passing it 3 times, I would know I'd completed 3 full circles. As I put the car in reverse, I realized the vehicle behind me hadn't stopped. It was so close now I could see exactly what it was. A white hatchback, security emblazoned on its side. I should have expected such a luxurious neighborhood to have private security, but I'd come too far to turn back now. I began driving in reverse. The security guard, who was no doubt tasked with deterring pests who come to see the tower, pulled into the roundabout to follow me. I was not dissuaded. Earlier in the day, I had practiced driving loops in reverse in an empty parking lot. I was confident I could do it safely. The security guard, a portly man in a mall's cop's uniform, trailed me as I drove in reverse. We were face to face, gliding in unison like synchronized skaters. It must have looked like something out of one of those Fast and Furious movies. The archway appeared beside me. One circle. The security guard laid on his horn, trying fruitlessly to get me to stop. I kept going and saw the archway again. 2 circles. As I crossed the halfway point of the final loop, the security guard flicked on the red and blue emergency lights atop his vehicle. I ignored it just a few more seconds as we passed the archway once more. 3 circles. The security vehicle was facing me almost bumper to bumper, blocking my path forward. I couldn't put the car in drive and do the ritual in the other direction as I planned. I decided to pull over and talk to the security guard, explain to him that I wasn't just some punk making trouble, but an actual scientific researcher, and maybe he wouldn't report me to the police. Maybe he'd even let me drive around the tower and leave. I pulled out of the middle of the roundabout back onto the long roadway. Started to pull over, watching the security vehicle drive towards me. And then it happened. The moment that still torments me in my nightmares. The security vehicle swerved wildly, accelerating until it escaped my rear mirror's field of view. Out of sight, I heard the sickening crunch of metal. I ran out of my car towards the security vehicle and had crashed headfirst into one of the pine trees lining the road. The front of the vehicle was totaled, the hood mangled like crumpled tinfoil. When I reached the tower driver's side window, that the security guard was slumped over the steering wheel, its leather soaked in wet blood. Something dawned on me. When the security guard chased me as I circled the tower backwards, he'd completed 3 circles forwards. I looked away from the wreck and up at the tower, and I saw her. Standing in the center window at the top of Devil's Tower, shrouded in the darkness of that decrepit chamber which had been long sealed shut, was a woman in the early 20th century dress. Harriet Rionda looked down at the mayhem below and smiled. I had been wrong about which variant of the ritual was correct. Driving around the tower backwards was a perversion of the real ritual, driving forwards. This ritual stuck around for decades despite its simplicity because it actually worked. I called 911 and explained the events leading up to the crash truthfully to the responding officers. They conferred before one returned to talk to me. "He was dead on impact," the officer said. "It looks like after you led him driving around in circles, he became dizzy. Vertigo, that's what it's called. He lost control of the car. We're not gonna charge you with anything. Just get on out of here." I was shocked. If the police thought I had caused the accident driving in an admittedly reckless manner, why wasn't I given so much as a ticket, much less arrested? "Get on out of here, son," the officer repeated, "for your own good." understood then that he knew the truth. I was responsible for the accident, just not in the way he said. Who knows how many times this small-town cop had the misfortune of responding to an accident at the tower. I got in my car and drove away out of the shadow of that abominable tower cast over Rio Vista. Please understand, I will regret that disastrous night at Devil's Tower until the end of my days. I never anticipated that I would unleash the deadly wrath of an angry spirit on another human being, but that is exactly what happened, and it will always haunt me. After that night, I canceled the remaining stops on my trip and returned to New England. I took a break from field work and worked on my dissertation, but I struggled with how to write about the tower. Eventually, I settled on addressing its dangers in a scientific manner acceptable to academics and on the dissertation committee. I chose to reveal Devil's Tower's true nature only to a more open-minded audience. You, the readers of this forum. At the bottom, it has some footnotes. Devil's Tower is a stone clock tower located in Alpine, New Jersey. According to tradition, driving one's vehicle around the tower 3 times summons an angry spirit who crashes the driver's car. While this is mere superstition, anecdotal evidence suggests that the prescribed ritual serves to perpetuate the legend. A recent fatal wreck demonstrated that circling the tower disorients drivers, placing them at an elevated risk of crash. Interesting. Okay, we're going to read one more story and then call it a night, I believe. This story is by WeirdBryceGuy, titled, "The Stranger Said I Could Keep the Contents of the Box if I Could Accurately Describe Them." I was allowed one peek inside the box, and then I had to describe the contents with complete accuracy to the man. If I could, without the slightest error, I would be allowed to keep the thing inside. The box, he said, would remain with him, and another copy of the item, which I could possibly possess as my own, would be newly generated by the box itself. The man had approached me almost out of thin air. I hadn't actually seen where he had come from. I'd been walking home from work and had passed through a derelict apartment complex, scheduled to be torn down, but until then tenanted by the homeless. A logical assumption about the man's origins would be that he was one such person, but his clothes, which were all in great condition, bespoke of a comfortably wealthy life, not one of squalor. He wore a nice collared gray cardigan, crisply ironed black slacks, and shoes that, despite the rain-sloshed ground, looked freshly polished. His face seemed to belong to someone in their early 60s, and yet he moved with a dexterity and grace more befitting someone my age. There was a certain showmanship about his gestures as he first introduced himself, and then gave me the spiel regarding the black box. Now, ordinarily, I wouldn't have thought a well-dressed man prancing about in the rain offering promises of value within a strange box to be a lunatic. Or at least some recently unhinged suburbanite. And while the man's eyes were alive with fiery excitement, they were also clear, focused. Not the glazed, cloudy look you'd normally expect to find in the eyes of a deranged man. For once, I had actually heeded the morning's forecast and had brought with me a thick raincoat. I wore this, and the rain's unyielding sheets felt no colder to me than a building's air conditioning, so I humored the man and agreed to his proposal. He paid no attention to the rain and had presumably dwelt beneath it without some issue for some time, considering his sudden interception of me. I nodded to the box. He outstretched it towards me and propped open the lid. Inside, almost to the small, perfectly square rim, was sort of a semi-liquid substance or semi-solid composition. It was like a black jelly and trembled slightly despite the man's perfectly steady hand. It was translucent, and through its murky surface I saw what appeared to be an even blacker gem within. A core or heart suspending amidst the substance, which somehow radiated a light or emitted something similar to light despite its totally black form. If shadows could somehow be lustrously cast, that gem's radiance was just such a phenomenon. Just as the liquid was clamped back over it, the thought within me came that the jelly surrounding the gem was not itself black, but colored that way by the Stygian luster of the gem within it. Well, the man's voice sounded eerily clear, despite the harshly audible fall of the rain upon the pavement around us. I felt vaguely unsettled, although I couldn't bring myself to pinpoint why. The feeling had come instantly upon the introduction of the idea that the gem could in some way discolor whatever touched it. I have no education in mineralogy, spectropsky, I cannot pronounce it for the moment, spectroscopy. My tongue is not working at the moment. Bear with me 1 second, I'm going to have a drink. Maybe if I wet my willow. Wet my whistle. Good Lord. I apologize. Okay, back where I was at. I have no education in mineralogy, spectroscopy, jewelry, or any object which might explain the phenomenon occurring within the box. And yet I felt, with a bizarre and rationally unfounded uncertainty, that the gem was in some way inimical, its properties unnatural. Leaving out the last bit regarding my suspicious thoughts, I related my observations to the man, just as I've described them to you. He listened intently, neither commenting or providing any facial expressions which might foretell of my success or failure. Once I had finished, he stood erect. He had leaned over intimately close while I spoke and brushed away some rainwater that had settled on the lid of the box. Then, producing a smile that was both reassuring to the casual gamer in me and yet deeply unsettling in some vague way, the man nodded in confirmation of my accuracy. I smiled back, mostly out of learned habit to do so when one is offered, and he motioned for me to hold out my hand. I removed my left hand from my jacket pocket and kept the right concealed in its own, wrapped around my house keys. That smile and the man's general behavior, including his still unexplainable appearance, had triggered an instinctual alarm within my mind. And I was willing, if not adequately prepared, to defend myself. The man brought the box toward my hand and slid the lid back and waited for me to grasp the gem. For some reason, the involved motion seemed to progress slowly, even though I hadn't hesitated and the man hadn't drawn the box away. When my fingers plunged into that black, or as I suspected, falsely black jelly, I felt a sensation of warmth, which I'll admit was the opposite of what I expected. The feeling glided up my arms, stopping just at my shoulders. I was somewhat unnerved, but not entirely alarmed, and wrapped my fingers around the gem. It was solid and felt a little brittle, so I gently withdrew it. Its slightly liquescent casing gave easily and did not cling to the gem. Once it had been deprived of its core, the liquid's black color faded to a softer gray, and I was given the impression that some inhuman yet undeniably existent life had been stripped from the substance with the removal of its heart. The man, still smiling, put the top back on the box, pocketed it, and turned to walk away. I asked him what I was supposed to do with it, and he called out without turning to face me. "Nurture it. In darkness, if you have any sense, but don't coddle it. You mustn't depend upon its warmth. When it's regrown its placental casing, show it to someone whose day needs a little blackening." Before I could ask anything else, a great torrent of rain swept through the street, obscuring all sight except for the towering forms of streetlights. And when it cleared, the man was nowhere to be seen. Dismally dismayed, I put the rock in a zip-up pocket within the interior of my jacket and continued my walk through the occasionally torrential rain. The warmth that had briefly coursed through my arm faded away. I live with my sister, or rather my sister lives with me, and though my income alone, and through my income alone, rent is paid, groceries are purchased, and a few allowances of entertainment, internet, Netflix, online gaming subscriptions are obtained. She can work, but refuses to, typically offering the excuse that because she had somewhat rough childhood, she is presently unfit to join the workforce until she acquires some sort of counseling. When I offer to pay for these sessions in exchange for the cancellation of one of the aforementioned services, she says it's not immediately necessary, and I counter with the need for employment being necessary. And this goes on indeterminately and frustratingly until I eventually have to go to work again. When I arrived home, soaked and feeling that I had somehow lost something, despite having literally won an object, my sister was sitting in the kitchen watching some video on the phone I'd bought her several months ago. The phone she had already grown tired of and often begged me to replace with its barely superior successor. I greeted her, and she responded by asking what was for dinner. Not feeling in the mood to start up some debate regarding the delegation of duties, I told her she could have whatever she wanted if she prepared it herself. Lying, I followed this up with the statement that I had already eaten, just so she couldn't nonchalantly ask me to prepare something for her while I cooked for myself. The burden of rain and the immediately related burden of the clothing it soaks can make one feel unexpectedly tired. As I placed my bag on the table to the living room where I set my things, I realized I wasn't even hungry, and really just wanted to climb into bed and rest. The day itself hadn't been tiring, but the rain and its accompanying bleak weather made the prospect of any other activity, well, unappealing. I ignored my sister's sour gaze and crossed arms, embarrassingly childish behavior for someone on the cusp of 30, and went upstairs. There, I stripped my wet clothing and tossed them into my bathtub to drain, since the dryer downstairs was momentarily inoperative, and I hadn't the money to afford getting it fixed. I did remove the gem beforehand and carried it to my room, where I studied it while sitting on my bed. The glow I had discerned earlier while it had been in the box was now absent, as a heart might cease to beat when ripped from its chest of origin. Thus rendered inert, it was fairly unremarkable, like a physically refined, though jagged piece of coal. I put on my bedside table, thinking I'd been duped, even though I hadn't offered anything besides my time, and went to sleep. The man's words regarding the gem's dubious ability to produce some sort of growth had completely left my mind during the walk home. I suddenly awoke to my sister standing over me, her hands reaching for my throat. I jerked away, almost knocking my head on the wall against which my bed is positioned. She frowned, her hands still poised as if to wrap around my neck. Rubbing the sleep from my eyes, I asked what she was doing, and she said she had come to ask if I'd order a pizza because there wasn't anything in the kitchen she'd like to eat. I always keep a mental record of the kitchen stores, and there were plenty of edible things, even a few decently palatable ingredients to be found among our measly supplies. When I explained this to her, she grew angry, and her hands twitched as if she truly meant to throttle me. Then, composing herself in her haughty, petulant way, she turned to leave. But on the way, her eyes caught sight of the gem on my table, and before I could hasten her exit, she reached out and seized the rock. Her eyes alight with a sudden avarice. In her relative poverty, she hadn't been able to afford jewelry, and I had unflinchingly refused to buy it for her. Knowing that my refusal of this item would result in an intolerant, mind-exhausting debate, I told her she could have it before she even thought to ask. Any other person might have inquired about its origin, properties, and purpose, but my sister, only thinking to have and take and indulge, spat out a half-hearted thanks and left the room. Unfortunately, I suffer from the curse of being unable to return to sleep once roused from it, so I lay awake mindlessly, only dimly aware of myself and the environment. The rain had continued through my short nap and seemed even to have intensified in the interim. I was thankful that my interaction with the strange man had been brief, or else I had been seriously endangered by being out there. Our small house, which I alone had inherited from my parents, but to which my sister had declared herself equally entitled, sat in a perpetually dismal little neighborhood outside of a dreary, soul-crushing city. It rained frequently, but the variance of intensity, direction, time, and coverage prevented one from being accustomed to it. It was always unexpected, always unwelcomed, and always sensorily dominating. So, lying there in my state of forced wakefulness, I could do nothing but think about and listen to the contemptible, chaotic rain. But about 10 minutes later, even that thoughtless peace of mind was revoked as a scream erupted from somewhere in the house. I dragged myself out of bed, somehow feeling more tired than I'd been earlier. The scream had obviously been my sister's, and I suspected she had tried to cook something for herself, and it hadn't gone well. But then another scream came, and I realized that she wasn't downstairs, but on the same floor as me, in her room. Terror crept into my heart as I sensed the direness of that scream. It wasn't some dramatic vocalization of exasperation or frustration. There had been panic, if not actual horror, in that awful cry. I rushed to her room, praying she'd left the door unlocked for once. I gripped the knob and threw open the door, but staggered back into the hall upon seeing the scene within. My sister was sitting on the foot of her bed, her hands clawed at her bare chest and her eyes, full of some indescribable horror, stared down at the spot where her fingers were violently digging into the skin. Blood ran down her fingers and dripped into her lap, but she paid no attention to it. And embedded within the center of her chest was a black rock. I tied a string to it and put it around my neck just to see what it looked like a necklace, and it just sank into my skin. Oh, please help me! I can't get it out! I can't get it out! Her nails tore at her chest, and bits of flesh went flying. Blood flecked every surface, and her eyes grew maniacally wide and inspiring a black horror within me. The gems seemed to burrow deeper with every attempt to pry it free. Understanding at once the correlation between her panicked screams and the gem's further absorption, I tried to convince her to stop, but she was inconsolable, insensate, and continued her frenzied clawing and shrieking. In only a few seconds, a bloody cavity had been made in her chest, and the area around it had been savagely scraped, raw flesh glistening beneath the ivory skin, and yet she somehow was not deterred. Sorry. I need to get a little drink here. Now, using her fingers as pliers, she reached into this grisly cavity and tried to pull the gem free, but it only withdrew from the probing fingers, situating itself in an unreachable place. In a moment of morbid clarity, which I suspect precedes death in many situations, my sister looked up at me, crimson-eyed and hideously distraught, and said, "I think
It's drinking my soul from the inside. A light then faded from her eyes, one I hadn't ever noticed throughout her life until it was gone. Her head fell forward, obscuring that newly made orifice. Despite life's departure from the body, the corpse still trembled as if something inside were moving about, or attempting to animate it with its own volition now that the former occupant had left. I watched a new horror be born at the sight of gruesome obscenity, of profanity against life itself. A black sludge first bubbled from the hole in her chest, making the head loll as it burst forth. Then the sludge spread throughout the body with a sickening rapidity, like the sudden onset and proliferation of some infectious disease. The body then started to violently shake, the limbs flailed, the head bobbed right and left, but the eyes, bereft of life, stared dumbly in whatever direction the head pointed them. In what couldn't have been more than 30 seconds, my sister's body was completely encased within a semi-solid shell of that horribly familiar black jelly-like substance. And only then, when she had been completely armored in the jet black ooze, did the gem resurface, gleaming, despite no light having fallen onto it. It stuck out from her chest, proudly protruding, glowing with some awful life force. Some impetus of primal courage demanded that I rush towards this abomination and rip from its chest that sinister gem, and yet my body was immovably frozen in fright. The emotions warred in my mind. I felt compelled to fight, to free my sister's corpse from this defiling object, and yet, in my sane and civilized life, I hadn't ever faced a situation even remotely similar. Before me was something I would have thought unreal if I hadn't seen it come into existence. Its resistances and abilities were unknown to me. Before I could dispel my horror long enough to make up my mind towards some action, the blackened figure arose, animated by the dark power which I now knew had existed within that abysmal gem since it first came into my possession. My sister's body, totally unidentifiable beneath the covering of filth, lumbered towards me silently, eerily, a necromantically driven automata of corrupted flesh. Now, looking back on that horrific night, I do regret my cowardice. But I hadn't any other option, at least not one which would have ensured my own safety. But before the slime-coated figure could reach me, I stepped out of the room, slammed the door shut. I then ran to my room and pulled on my still soaking coat and fled downstairs. I heard footsteps overhead, stomping about aimlessly as if the reanimated corpse was attempting to figure out its next course of action. Apparently, its sludge-covered hands were incapable of gripping the doorknob. Figuring that the rain was more manageable than the monstrosity upstairs, I opened the door and plunged into the torrential night, forever leaving behind the thing that had been once been my sister. I walked for what
might have been 15 minutes before a thought popped into my head that stopped me short and reignited the soul-crushing terror which had almost ebbed away. The man who had given me the gem said that upon its removal from the box would generate a new one by itself. As the rain poured relentlessly, brutally, I shook in place, but not from the frigidity of these unceasing droplets, but from the unsettling revelation that out there somewhere the man was stalking about, perhaps even offering at that very moment some unfortunately oblivious person the same deal he had offered me. I decided then not only to forsake my creature-haunted home, but that dismal city as well.
Well, now, that was interesting, don't you think? I'm not sure if anybody's still here listening, but if you are, I think we're going to call it a night tonight. I know that some of you may not have had the opportunity to listen in at the beginning, but if you have shown up late or missed any part of the line stream, remember I do leave the streams up on my channel. You can also direct friends and family to them in case they are unable to make our visiting hours. I do also want to remind you all to check out the authors. I make sure to place a link to reach them in the description below at all times. And I would like to thank the authors for joining me in this asylum and allowing me to read from their twisted minds stories that send those shivers down your back. Now, I'm sure this last story definitely gave you a chill, raised the hair on the back of your neck. And if not, I'm sure we'll find other stories in the future that can do that for you. But we have finally reached the end of our time together this evening. Visiting hours are now over. And while I hope to see you all here again, perhaps I can convince you to be permanent residents of the asylum. I am Beyond 5150, and I wish you all wonderful nightmares. Good night. Sleep well, and just ignore the screams.